Hey everyone, welcome back to Engelbart Gaming. Today I've got another episode of utterly pointless comparisons for you. This time I'll be looking at the arcade and Sega Dreamcast versions of Namco's Soul Calibur. You might think that the arcade versions of games are always the best versions, and if you think that,
well, you're wrong!
And hey, this is a special occasion. It's the first time the Dreamcast has ever shown up in an episode of UPC. So here's a look at the hardware specs for each system while I tell you just a smidge about the game itself. Namco released Soul Calibur, the follow-up to Soul Edge, on the Namco System 12 arcade hardware in 1998. The System 12 was essentially a souped-up PlayStation with a higher CPU clock speed and double the video RAM. As a side note, the specs for the System 12 say its CPU runs at 48 MHz, but MAME's internal info claims that it's running at 100. And while I usually go with MAME, I could not find any other source anywhere that lists it at 100 MHz. The System 12 games looked very PlayStation-y despite the slight spec boost, as you can see with Soul Calibur here. To be perfectly honest, while I like Soul Calibur, it's very much a button masher style fighting game where amateurs pretty much always have a chance at winning. But not every fighting game needs to be a technical masterpiece, and the game is fun. The arcade version looks fine, and it looks a lot better than the first game, Soul Edge, but it still looks very much like a PlayStation title. Now on the Polygon Fighter front, this was competing with stuff like Virtua Fighter 3, which it came out in 1996, and Fighting Vipers 2, which came out in 1998, the same year as this game, among several others. Now Namco made the incredibly odd decision to bring Soul Calibur home exclusively to the Sega Dreamcast. Now Sega was their biggest competitor in the arcade scene at the time, which is why it seemed really strange back then. So Soul Calibur for the Dreamcast came out a bit after the system launched in Japan, but was a launch title here in the US on 9/9/1999. And as you can see, it looks just a little different from the arcade version. Namco really went all out with this arcade port, and obviously they cleaned up the graphics tremendously, and they added the meaty mission mode to unlock stuff, team battles, artwork, and lots of different options and extras. Soul Calibur for the Dreamcast was very well received, and really showed what the Dreamcast was capable of very early on in its life. Alrighty, recording methodology for this one. Pretty much the normal stuff. I edited out losing rounds to keep the video as short and tight as possible. For the arcade version, I ran it at a reduced speed to compensate for the fact that it runs too fast in MAME in non-interlaced mode. As a side note, it runs too slow in interlaced mode. So unfortunately, I'll also mention the speed change affected the pitch and tempo of the sound and music. So I took out the music from the arcade version and will only hear the Dreamcast version during the comparison, but they're very similar anyway. So stick around to the end for a special little treat where you might learn a thing or two that you did not know about Soul Calibur. Alrighty, let's get on with it. And here we go. You can see already at the character select screen, the much higher resolution on the Dreamcast makes this game look tremendously better on Sega's system. And just look at the difference. This is one of those rare comparisons where I'm going to say, you guys should pause this and take a look at those screens. If you're on a phone or something right now, you want to zoom in and really get a look at one of these next to the other to truly see just what a giant leap this game made when it left the System 12, and arrived on the Dreamcast. I mean, there's just no comparison. It looks so much better on the Dreamcast. We have texture filtering, we have a much cleaner, higher resolution. The characters have way more details, on their clothing and their designs. There's a lot more stuff going on like just the general on the floors and in the backgrounds. We can see there's water and stuff on this one. As Mitsurugi walks close up here, you can see the face way more detailed, looks quite a bit different in the Dreamcast version. One thing you may not have noticed yet is a lot of the background elements are 2D in the arcade version of the game, but they are fully 3D and polygonal in the Dreamcast version. Now for this stage, while it still looks way better on the Dreamcast, some people may feel like this one looks just a smidge better in the original when it comes to colors. It's a little more drab on the Dreamcast for this stage, but a lot of the other stages look way more vibrant on Sega's console here. Now Soul Calibur, if you're not really familiar with it, if you've never played any of the games in the series, as I mentioned kind of in the intro here, it's a bit of a button masher. You have 2 attack buttons for your weapon, 1 for kicking, and then you have a block button. You can also move in full 3 dimensions. You can circle your opponent either above or below them, and have pretty much free reign to move around the arena. So it's a lot more complicated with more complex controls than we would see in several other fighting games of the era, especially with its 3D movement. But the gameplay is still very, very simple in this. There's lots of different moves, lots of combinations. You'll get double tap moves. You'll get triple tap moves in some cases where you press a direction 3 times and a button and it does something, for your character. But they're just it's so simplistic when it comes to pulling off just even basic devastating moves that anyone stands a chance at winning in this game when you're playing 2 players. Case in point here, well, I'm no Soul Calibur expert. I'll tell you right now, it is not one of my favorite games out there. I had to play my son on this one of my sons, for the 2-player mode, so I could match up the characters and the backgrounds to the arcade version. I just couldn't get them to sync up, no matter how many times I reset the Dreamcast one. It looks like it just doesn't do that. So, my son, who had never touched this game in his life, still managed to beat me quite a few rounds while we were playing together while I was recording this. Anyway, go back to the backgrounds here. You can see once again on the Dreamcast, tremendously more detail. I mean, just look at the statue, look at the way the lava looks, and just the clarity of the buildings and stuff in the background. It's a really huge difference there again. It's unmatched. Now, like I mentioned before, the arcade version of Soul Calibur, when you're running it on MAME these days, and it's been like this as long as it's emulated Soul Calibur, does not run at the right speed. Because of that, you have basically 2 options. You can play it in its non-interlaced mode, which is what we're doing here, where the game runs a little too fast, or you can play it in the interlaced mode, where the game runs considerably too slow. Now, how do you get around this and get this to run at approximately the same speed, that it would ordinarily run in the arcade? Well, you can go into MAME's options and reduce the speed that the game runs at in total. You can also do underclocks and stuff, but I didn't really want to get involved with too much detail there, because the sound between these games is the same. So I removed the sound, because in the arcade version, when I changed the game speed, the sound got slower and it was weird. Well, the pitch changed and the tempo changed, as I mentioned before. But the sound is very similar between these 2 games. You'll hear the sound in the arcade version again during the wrap-up after I show you the comparison here. So the Dreamcast music and sound is maybe a little bit clearer. It doesn't sound like it got a full remaster, but maybe they went in and tweaked some things. It sounds just a little bit nicer. If it's the same, I'll be shocked, because it sounds like some of the instruments have a little more presence, like they might have tweaked reverb and some other stuff for different instruments and a few volumes, it sounds like. If anybody knows for sure, go ahead and reply in the comments and tell me. I couldn't find the specifics of what they did. And this is another stage that looks absolutely incredible in the Dreamcast version. Just all the details on the rock floor, all the different colors, just the sharpness of it is so good. And I've got to say, the Dreamcast really feels like it was kind of the first modern system, similar to the way things look now. I mean, obviously games today, 26 years later, look a lot better than this, but it doesn't seem like a lot of the style and techniques of rendering and creating characters has really changed much in those days. Feels like the biggest difference today is in games like Soul Calibur. Sure, characters have more polygons in the new versions than here, as you'd expect them to, but it's really the backgrounds where they add way more detail and stuff like that. But the overall style and look of the game, it's not that hugely different in things that came in some future generations on platforms, like the PlayStation 2 and even the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360. So the Dreamcast was really our gateway into the modern era of gaming. Now, one thing I do have to say about this stage is I actually think the design on the floor looks a little bit nicer on the arcade version, where the tiles have more of a sort of a worn look than they do on the Dreamcast one. This is one where I think it looks a little too clean on Dreamcast. It could have used a bit of weathering, so to speak. But getting back to the other stage elements here, just look at those boats in the background. In the System 12 version, they're very small, they're very low detail, you can hardly make out anything on them. While in the Dreamcast version, they are very highly detailed, and they look much more impressive. So while things are silent here on the Dreamcast and we wait, just look at that close-up of Mitsurugi during his, win quote on the Dreamcast version. Alright, and here we go, we have slightly different lighting effects. for when we go into our fight with Inferno, the final boss of Soul Calibur. Inferno wields pretty much any weapon he wants at any time and can mimic the moves of any character, specifically the one that uses the weapon that he's using at the time. Now this is one background where they really changed the look and the effects of it. We've got a lot more complicated lighting on the Dreamcast version, and then the background effect is way different. In the System 12 arcade original, we've got sort of an aurora effect, while in the Dreamcast version they went with something a lot more complicated. The stars, rotate and dash around in a bit more of a complex manner, and they have this smeary, bendy light that seems to emanate from a center point instead of the aurora. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this game during the credits, and then some of those extra bonus things I told you I would mention. I'm going to do that in the wrap-up at the end, after the comparison here. Come on, Mitsurugi, let's finish taking him out already. And there we go. That is Inferno taken out in both versions of the game. And believe it or not, they're already done with Soul Calibur. And there we go, there's our ultimate victory. Here's our explosion of Inferno scene. Again, we have a bit of a nicer effect on the Dreamcast version. This is a short title, folks. That's why it's really good in the Dreamcast version. They added so much extra stuff, which I'll talk about in just a minute. So check out the artwork here. In the arcade version, we've got the same picture, but it's way lower resolution and it looks a lot, more pixely, and it's just dotty and it's hard to see things. The Dreamcast one is slightly more zoomed in, but it's so much clearer. It looks like they just, had the original artwork still around and probably just rescanned it at a higher resolution. That'll be my guess. Here's the same scene now in both versions. Again, you can see it was more zoomed in. Now on the Dreamcast, it switches to this third picture, and that's because this one's not in the arcade version's ending. So it has to cycle through 3 pictures during the ending instead of 2, which is why we see that one now and the second one in the arcade. So on the Dreamcast, we're going to move now to the main credits. We'll head to the main credits here in the arcade version a lot more slowly, but we're going to get there. So what else can I really say about these two versions of Soul Calibur? The one thing I want to stress, and that I cannot stress enough, is just the huge generational leap that took place between the System 12 version of the game and the Dreamcast version of the game. The hardware in the Dreamcast, when we're talking about real-time power, real processing, can process roughly about 8 or 9 times as many fully textured polygons with lighting effects and shadows and all that jazz as the System 12. And it has more effects than that System 12 had. So 8 or 9 times, when you think about it, that is a giant generational leap. We don't usually see things like that anymore. When we go up from one generation to another now, companies say, hey, this is 5 times faster or 10 times faster. But when you look at all the games, there's just no evidence of that. Most of the time, if you're lucky, you'll get about double the performance. So this really was evidence of the last, I think, huge generational leap that we had. I'm talking from, say, the Saturn and PlayStation to the Dreamcast and PlayStation 2. Everything after this has been very incremental. We get a few more polygons, we might have a higher resolution, we might get a better frame rate if we're lucky and stuff. But for the most part, we don't see paradigm-shifting changes in hardware anymore. And it's actually kind of a bit sad that we're in this place now. Because while sure, things still keep getting better, there's never that wow moment where you look at something and you think, hey, this is something I never expected to see before. This does not look like anything that could have remotely existed before this moment in time on this piece of hardware. It just seems like those days are long behind us. And this whole generation, for which I'll include the Dreamcast, PlayStation 2, GameCube, and Xbox, it was a lot like moving from 8-bit to 16-bit. When we moved from 8 to 16-bit, pixel graphics were vastly improved from one generation to the next. In this generation, polygon graphics were vastly improved from the Saturn and PlayStation to where we ended up. Alright, stick around just for another minute or so for the wrap-up, in which I'll give you some more interesting facts that you might not have known about Soul Calibur. So that does it for the arcade versus the Dreamcast version of Soul Calibur. While I wrap this up, have a look at the US version of the arcade title here and the character Arthur. Who the hell is Arthur, you may be wondering? Here's the thing, Namco apparently modified Mitsurugi into Arthur to make the game more acceptable in different countries like South Korea, where because of history between the countries, samurai-based characters often get a negative reception. Why do we have our blonde, blue-eyed, eye-patch-wearing Arthur in the US version then? I don't know, they probably thought Americans would prefer a dude named Arthur to one named Mitsurugi, I guess. Regardless, Arthur plays exactly the same as Mitsurugi, and he still looks like a samurai, so in the end, I'm not really sure what Namco accomplished with this change. Also, you might be wondering why they called this game Soul Calibur instead of Soul Edge 2. Well, there's a story behind that one too, and it's all about copyright. Someone claimed they own the copyright to the word Edge as it pertained to game titles, and rather than fight it, Namco just changed the name to Calibur. And according to sources like Sega Retro, linked below by the way, Namco purposely spelled Calibur the way they did to avoid any similar problems in the future. As a side note, EA defeated the guy claiming he owned the copyright to the name Edge in court, but that was not until years later. As far as the games go, the arcade versus the Dreamcast version, there's not really much room for debate here. I mean, this is a slam dunk. The Dreamcast version absolutely trounces the arcade version, and really, it should, since it's on newer and vastly superior hardware. This is from back in the days when generational leaps really meant something. Soul Calibur is a Dreamcast classic, and there's a reason that this is the version of the game that people know and remember. If you've only played the sequels, you may be surprised at just how good this one still looks and plays on Sega's final home console. And I heartily recommend giving it a try. So what do you all think? Have you played arcade Soul Calibur before? Which version is your favorite? Is there anyone out there that prefers the arcade version to the Dreamcast version? Tell me all about it in the comments. That'll do it for this video, my retro gaming friends. If you enjoyed the video, please like and share it online somewhere. If you haven't yet, please subscribe to my channel and hit the notification bell so you won't miss any of my videos. If you want to support the work that I do here, you can do that on Patreon, Ko-fi, or right here on YouTube through channel memberships and super thanks. With that, I'll say thanks for watching, and see me later.